This Future Cities Africa episode is presented in partnership with OneMap. Visit them at onemap.co.za. Miriam Maina is my guest today on Future Cities Africa. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Witwatersrand. She's a town planner and researcher on African cities, with a particular focus on the role of policy in shaping urban futures in Africa. Miriam, welcome. Give us a brief introduction to your background and your academic interests.
I'm originally from Nairobi, Kenya, and now I'm based here in Johannesburg, South Africa. So I'm trained as a town planner first of all, from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and then I came here to Johannesburg. So I've been here for a few years, sort of expanding my knowledge and research on cities. That's my background, and my academic interests really have been on not just town planning, but on the sort of project of city building, and especially how public sector planning and policy making tries to achieve better urban spaces for all who live in it. So it's a research on policy, it's research on urban growth and the different dynamics that shape city development, especially in Africa. And my focus then has been on the two cities that I've sort of lived in, which is Nairobi and Johannesburg.
So on the topic of preparing for future cities, what is organic growth versus proactive town planning and city management? And in which countries have you seen success in Africa and internationally?
From the data on African urbanization, which is sort of projected to drive most of the world's urbanization in the next few decades, it looks like we are going to have a lot of more cities and mega cities in Africa. Presently, we have maybe 3 mega cities, but these are projected to grow in the next few decades. But the urbanization in Africa is also being driven from the smaller towns and secondary cities that have a population of, say, 250,000 residents. And most of the discussions are about how is this growth going to be managed. And traditionally, we have these sort of formal proactive systems of town planning that attempt to prepare or set up the rules about how a city is going to grow before the city is urbanized. But what we've been observing more and more, especially in African towns and cities, is a more organic form of growth and development that is not necessarily planned, which then creates this dichotomy of what we consider a formal, planned, or good city or ideal city, and an informal, unplanned bad that we need to correct. And I think what we can begin to look at is this sort of organic form of growth and urbanization is really what has driven most of the expansion of the cities in Africa, and how do we use the formal tools that were supposed to prepare these spaces to instead adapt the cities that we have now so that we can have a more equitable, accessible, or organized form of urbanization and growth. Because as much as the organic is what we see, it's not necessarily the most ideal. And there are a lot of challenges that these sort of patterns of growth come with that need to be addressed by the formal systems of planning. So the question is, how do we use the formal tools and systems to adapt these sort of less organized organic forms to create a sort of urban space that is equitable, especially, and accessible to all residents? I wouldn't want to point to any city at the moment, but I do think that this is a conversation that we'll be having more and more across African cities and in terms of lessons sharing.
Would you say organic growth is a good idea for African countries and cities? And where has this been the standard practice in Africa?
The organic city that appears unplanned or disorganized is really something that has been pulled together by the energy of households and farms just trying to get a foothold in the city. And when we try to transition this, or when you try to point to that as a sort of bad urbanization that needs correcting, then the systems through which we try to intervene sometimes end up disrupting the lives of the very civilians we are trying to help. So pointing to it as either good or bad, I think, would be a contested idea and something that we can continue to think about. But what maybe is a more useful question is, how do we then make sure that these sort of organic forms of urbanization are incorporated into what we consider to be the rest of the functional or planned or efficient city that we're trying to plan for?
What then happens to town planning policies? Who informs them? Who implements them? Why don't policies always reach their goals, and why is there a need for improved policies?
So in my research on policy implementation, we really find that the act of policy implementation requires the coordinated actions of very many departments and institutions working together. So, and this is one of the misconceptions we have when we consider, when we talk about plans that are failing, maybe policies that are not being achieved. So that policy implementation gap that is normally very common in the literature and in the analysis and in discussion in general. But when you come to really unpack how policies are implemented, you find that, for example, something as simple as upgrading an informal settlement or improving a neighborhood that has not been provided with services requires the coordination of private sector, public sector, the channeling of budgets and resources to make sure that the plans that we make on paper can be met in a few years or in a few decades without necessarily disrupting the lives of the residents who live there. And policy then becomes less about what we put on paper and more about how the different agencies that are expected to deliver something work together to make sure that this is achieved in the end. So yeah, it turns out to be more of a coordination problem or a coordination glitch across the different departments. Policies take very long to implement and things change along the way. So it's coordination, but also how do you adjust your goals and your systems and your means of implementation as you try to drive towards that agenda in the end.
On challenges, why are all these things that we know are necessary for city management success not in place? For instance, data collection, access to technology, lack of digital property registers, silos in governments and funding, and much more.
So yeah, narrowing it down again just to built environment, I think we underestimate sort of that coordination problem or the sort of silo-based structure that we have sort of organized most government agencies, not just here, but across the world. And how do you begin to break down these silos to work together in an integrated fashion for delivery of plans or projects or strategies? We have been seeing a lot of headway when it comes to, for example, the integrated planning that we have been seeing, for example, here, but also the opening up of different data systems or technologies that are used within a certain department, for example, to understand how things are achieved. But when you begin to coordinate, for example, to look at the land use, if we just take some, like two of the things that are normally not well coordinated is land use planning and development, and the economic strategies of uplifting an area or residents within a space. So if you begin to make spatial land use plans work together with economic aspirations, whether it's of the government for its people, or maybe improving on what the people are doing for their own economic development, and begin to connect how we are shaping the space with how we are trying to earn a living, you begin to see some more coordination coming up so that we're not just building settlements that are not necessarily useful for people's economic development, but beginning to integrate some of our solutions so that we can combine some of these goals. But at the same time, this is being made easier and easier with the developments that we see in data, in technology, and in the digital space, because previously some of this coordination was harder and harder to do in a more analog system, I would argue. But when things are more coordinated and when we have a more coordinated and connected system of decision-making, of collecting information, of analyzing problems, and of making different decisions irrespective of which department you're working from, we begin to see some synchronized action that I think would not have been achieved otherwise, or for some reason was not being achieved in the past. So for example, the growth and expansion of GIS technologies and of the digitization of sort of spatial information and land use information. So not just sort of GIS of drawing maps, but actually being able to understand the way space is being organized and the way space is changing. So the way space is being used right now, what trends are happening and how these are changing and how these imply, what the implications are for the future development of the cities. So geospatial information, geospatial intelligence, and being able then to look, and I think that has really been revolutionary, not just because it's been able to digitize our understanding of space, but because we can be able to now to overlay different forms of information or different forms of understanding space and the flows of action and the flows of humans and the flows of development and investment. So I think not so much the geospatial intelligence for the tools that it provides, but for the ability that it can unleash within the different stakeholders and players in space. And we can see that mostly it's really not affecting, but it's really been able to connect. So for example, the city departments and the city planners and the different city departments or the different provincial or national government departments can begin to operate or work on the same portals and the same geospatial information systems. And then we can begin to understand who is doing what where. And then how can we all work together to make sure that we're driving or pulling or pushing in the same direction. That's the one thing. So it combines and allows different actors to work together with the same tools or with the same space or with the same language. But at the same time, it also allows and shortens the time it takes to communicate information or to access information, whether it's for residents trying to. So for example, the digitization of a land registry, something very small it seems, but is very essential because it really shortens the process through which citizens can access information about different land parcels. What is the zoning, what are the rules, what are the rights on individual property parcels. But also if you're trying to register a property before you would have to go through paper systems and find different records of different parcels from different sites. Now, if we can simply digitize that process, then that really shortens that process and makes things relatively more efficient. Greater coordination and increased efficiency hopefully would drive more coordinated action in future.
Why isn't it in place in cities? What do you think is inhibiting uptake?
Yeah, so the uptake has been slow, but it's happening slowly. We can see it being picked up in different cities. For example, some very encouraging news that has come from Kenya, whereby we can see the land registry has finally been digitized. And this, as you can see from the articles and the data, is pointing to sort of a new form of management of the land information system. But on top of that, the planning systems that sort of the land use systems, the property management systems, but also hopefully the future urban development systems would be underpinned by a sort of collective digital register that everyone can point to and work from. The uptake may be slow because of something either to do with infrastructure or something to do with the capacity and the uptake. And obviously when it comes to transitioning some of these systems, I think they could take time. But I think it also points to the lack of capacity and the technical know-how to use some of these tools to drive the future change that we're pointing to.
What new or modern skills do town planners need to craft powerful policies that will shape African cities? For example, GIS knowledge, data analysis, technical proficiency, and more.
The skills of planning requires sort of the ability to be able to read and understand what is happening at the present, to connect that to the different forces that have gotten us here from the past. And this could be geopolitical, social, economic forces. And then to be able to sort of imagine a different future, if it's a different future, and then guide the different actors to achieve that future. So it's a combined set of skills that then require sort of the technical capacity to understand what to do and how to toggle which levers to achieve which desired end goal, but also the ability to communicate this desired end goal to different players. And that becomes very interesting because then the different skills we need as planners is the ability to be able to communicate to different actors, whether it's political actors, whether it's economic players in the financial sector and the real estate sector that builds the cities, but also then the citizens and the residents that live in this city that need to understand what is happening and where we are going as residents and as citizens of a space. So I think some of the technical skills of being able to communicate, especially sort of so most of the planning, education, and training is on sort of being able to theoretically understand and conceptualize what is happening and how we've gotten here, and be able to present different scenarios of where we can go in future. So explore different pathways of development in future. And how do you communicate this to different players? So I see skills, for example, such as GIS, data analytics, technical proficiency to be able to present different scenarios to different audiences coming in more and more powerfully, but also being encouraged and supported by the developments that are happening in technology. So we've been seeing different types of tools that allow planners to communicate. Not that they were not there in the past, but more and more you can be able to communicate with different types of audiences from the same sort of platforms or portals. And these are really providing, enhancing what planners can and cannot do to drive the different futures that we are hoping for. So I was pointing to, for example, being able to visualization, whether it's to use different types of data to project trends, but also not just to understand what you're doing, but also to speak to the different audiences and sort of connect them to the different types of future we are achieving. Because yeah, such urban developments would only be achieved by pulling all these actors together to drive in the same direction. And previously, or not necessarily previously, but even in the present, we tend to see cities that either work for a very small select number of people, but not necessarily for all. So planning also has to contend with the nature in which urban development happens, that sometimes tends to not be inclusive. So it's not necessarily inclusive growth, and planners don't just have them. And when I speak of planners, I'm really being general, but all I'm trying to point to is that planning has to mediate between sometimes conflicting or contradictory expectations of people. And that becomes a very complex space that, unfortunately, I mean, it's how do you mediate the forces or the different needs of people that sometimes can actually be pulling in different directions.
Africa is expecting several of its cities to reach megacity status in the near future. Is it too late to implement effective city growth policies for those cities? And how can they adapt and prepare for what is to come?
From the discussion on African urbanization, we can see that Africa's growth, or the growth of urban areas in Africa is going to, number one, is going to drive most of the urbanization for the next few decades. So that is an interesting point to sort of bookmark, the fact that most of this growth will be happening within this region in the next few decades. But also this growth is happening at an unprecedented rate. So it is not like any growth that has been seen anywhere else, I believe. And thirdly, this growth is, so we normally focus on the mega cities. So Africa has, I think, 3 mega cities or so by now, which is a population of 10 million and above, but this is projected to grow. But a more significant growth is also going to happen in what is called the small and medium-sized cities or secondary towns, which have a smaller population of 250 to 300,000 at the moment. But these are going to grow. These articles are projecting almost 500 of these cities exist within the continent already. And these are going to drive most of this growth in future. So when we think about African urbanization, we shouldn't just focus on the huge 10 million plus cities, but on all these other small urban areas that are already here, but that are going to be there in the next few decades. And how do we begin to imagine or envision how this growth can be organized in such a way that then drives a more equitable form of urbanization or a more inclusive form of urbanization within the continent? So it's not too late, I believe, because it's never too late. And also because as much as it's urbanizing last, there's also a lot of changes that have happened globally that we can tap into and sort of leapfrog some of the challenges that the other cities went through. And this is, I think, exciting times to be doing any kind of planning work within any of these towns, because we do have the opportunity to capitalize on all the lessons and all the lessons that have been learned from the other cities around the world. We can learn from them and begin to adapt some of these lessons for our specific context that is arguably very unique. So then how can we, I think the question that you asked is a question I can turn back to you and to my fellow colleagues and planners. How can we adapt all the skills that we have learned to create or to produce different types of cities in future for our continent? It's an exciting opportunity, I believe, and I can't wait to see what will happen. We don't have all the answers today. We cannot say that this is what the future will look like, but what we can say is we can be able to use the tools and technologies at the present to project the kinds of growth we can anticipate, and using some of these tools and to be able to mediate a sort of more equitable, resilient, or sustainable urban future. for the continent.